The woman packing to leave froze when the rancher quietly placed her debt receipt back on the table with a single new stamp across it. The kitchen was so quiet, Ruth could hear the coffee dripping into the cracked blue mug by Elias Boone's hand. Dust swirled through the open doorway behind him, and his coat still smelled like cold morning air from Fort Worth. He slid the folded clinic paper across the table without sitting down. Ruth looked at the blue stamp once, then stopped breathing for a second. What do you think Elias did before sunrise? The wind carried stockyard dust clear across the edge of Fort Worth that morning, coating the porch rails of Hollow Creek livestock in a thin brown film. Ruth Carter stopped outside the office long enough to smooth the wrinkles from her dark traveling coat before stepping inside. In her gloved hand, she carried a folded receipt from Miller Creek Clinic. The paper softened at the creases from being opened too many times. Her brother's name still sat near the bottom in faded ink. The office smelled of tobacco, leather, and old rain trapped inside warped boards. A heavy-set foreman stood behind the desk, sorting cattle invoices with thick fingers stained by printer's ink. He barely glanced up before sliding a paper across the counter toward her. The agreement had only half a page of terms, but Ruth read every line anyway, eyes steady beneath the brim of her worn hat. Outside, wagon wheels rattled over the frozen ruts along County Road 19. For 3 days, the foreman said flatly, tapping the paper with one knuckle, "You belong to the Boone Ranch." The words landed harder than he probably meant them to. Ruth kept her face still. She had spent too many years learning what dignity looked like when money ran short and choices ran shorter. The clinic debt would not disappear on kindness alone, and there was no one left to split the burden with her now. After a moment, she reached for the pen beside the ledger book and signed her name in neat, careful letters. Ruth Carter. The office door opened behind her before the ink dried. Cold air swept in first, followed by a tall man carrying the smell of horses and cedar smoke on his coat. Elias Boone stepped inside with dust across his shoulders and a stiff leather brace hidden beneath the glove on his right hand. His face looked carved from something older than the hills west of town, roughened by weather and too much silence. His gray eyes moved from the foreman to the signed paper, then to Ruth, only for a second. "You already had her sign?" Elias asked quietly. The foreman shrugged. "Work starts today." Something tightened in Elias's jaw, though he said nothing more. Ruth noticed the irritation immediately. Not anger toward her exactly. Something more restrained than that, as if he disliked being decided for. The wagon ride west took nearly 2 hours beneath a pale February sky. Dry grass bent sharp along the roadside while distant cattle moved like dark stains across the open pasture. Elias handled the reins one-handed most of the way, his injured hand resting stiff near his knee whenever the trail smoothed enough to allow it. Neither of them spoke much. The Boone Ranch sat beyond a sagging cedar gate half buried in drifting dust. The ranch house itself was plain and sturdy, built low against the wind with a narrow porch and smoke curling steady from the chimney. Ruth heard horses shifting in the nearby stalls before she even climbed down from the wagon. The place was quiet in a way that felt practiced. Inside, the house carried the order of a man, living alone too long. A cast stove stood near the back wall beside neatly stacked firewood. One cracked blue coffee mug rested upside down near the sink as though it had not moved in years. Elias set her small satchel near the hallway without ceremony. "Room's there," he said. That was all. By evening, the cold front had arrived proper, rattling the windows, while the smell of beans and salt pork filled the kitchen. Elias ate standing beside the stove, instead of sitting across from her at the table. Once or twice Ruth caught him glance toward her folded coat hanging near the door, but whenever she looked back directly, his eyes shifted away. She mistook the distance for dislike. After supper, she washed her own plate, dried it carefully, and placed it back beside the others. Elias nodded once in acknowledgement before stepping outside to check the barn lanterns. Through the window, Ruth watched him pause against the wind, shoulders rigid beneath the dark coat while the horses stirred softly in the stalls beyond. The ranch felt lonely enough to echo. Later, when she finally entered the small room prepared for her, she stopped short at the sight, waiting outside the door. A thick wool blanket had been folded neatly over the chair beside the bed, still carrying faint warmth from the stove. No note, no explanation. Ruth touched the rough fabric slowly with her fingertips while the wind pressed hard against the house. Somewhere outside, Elias crossed the porch boards on his way back from the barn, boots heavy and measured in the dark. Something about the ranch already felt less temporary than it should have. Morning came pale and dry over the Boone Ranch. Thin sunlight slipped through the kitchen window while dust hissed softly against the porch screen, carried in long streams from the western pasture. Ruth woke before Elias and stood for a moment beside the stove, warming her hands, listening to the slow creak of the house settling against the cold. The silence no longer felt empty exactly. She found the coffee tin beside the cracked blue mug near the sink and brewed a fresh pot strong enough to cut through the lingering smell of saddle oil and wood smoke hanging in the kitchen. While the biscuits browned in the oven, she noticed a torn feed ledger left open beside a stack of horse invoices. Several pages had worked loose from the stitching along the spine. Without asking, she repaired it. By the time Elias entered from the yard carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder, the ledger sat neatly rebound beside his plate. He stopped near the table, gray eyes lowering first to the coffee, then to the repaired book. Dust streaked the front of his coat, and the leather brace beneath his glove looked tighter this morning somehow. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Ruth spread jam over a biscuit without looking up. It was already falling apart. That seemed to leave him without an answer. Outside, freight wagons rolled distant and hollow toward the rail depot east of Fort Worth, their wheels rattling across frozen ground. Elias spent most of the morning near the horse pens while Ruth cleaned shelves inside the house, quietly reorganizing bottles of liniment and old bandages stacked beside the stove. One bottle carried a faded label nearly worn white with age. Expired 3 years ago. She placed it aside without comment. Near midday, Ruth carried a basket of cracked tack leather out to the barn doorway and settled onto an overturned crate with needle and waxed thread in hand. The February wind came dry across the pasture, stirring loose strands of hair beneath her scarf while horses shifted in their stalls nearby. Elias worked farther down the rail fence, replacing a warped board. Movement steady but slower whenever his right hand carried too much strain. Twice she noticed him hide the stiffness. The third time, he caught her watching. For a second, neither of them looked away. Then Elias bent again to the fence post, jaw tight beneath the shadow of his beard. Ruth lowered her eyes back to the leather in her lap, though she stitched the same section twice before realizing it. That evening they ate stew at the kitchen table while the wind rattled softly through the chimney pipe overhead. Elias usually stood while he ate, but tonight he sat across from her without seeming aware he'd done it. The cracked blue mug rested near his elbow, one thumb moving absently along the chipped handle between bites. Ruth glanced toward the quiet room around them. "Does it always stay this still out here?" Elias took too long answering. Mostly. His voice came low and rough from disuse. Ruth lifted her eyes then. Elias met them fully for the first time since she arrived, and something uncertain moved through the silence between them. Not comfort, exactly, but not distance either. Later, while putting away the clean dishes, Ruth found a folded document buried beneath a stack of invoices near the pantry shelf. The paper carried the red stamp of Trinity County Bank across the top, though no signature appeared at the bottom where one should have been. Final notice. Her eyes moved slowly over the lines mentioning overdue land payments and spring restructuring terms tied to the south pasture acreage. Outside, she heard Elias crossing from the barn again, boots scraping dirt from the porch before entering the house. Ruth folded the paper carefully back where she found it, just as the kitchen door opened. Elias paused inside the doorway, cold air curling around him. Neither of them spoke. Ruth stepped aside from the pantry shelf, first, wiping her hands slowly against her skirt, as though she had been doing nothing more than putting away dishes. Elias removed his hat, setting it near the cracked blue mug by the stove, but his eyes lingered a second too long on the stack of invoices beside the wall. He knew exactly which paper she might have seen. Still, he asked nothing. The next morning broke colder than the one before. Frost clung white along the fence rails while low clouds drifted over the pasture west of County Road 19. Ruth stood near the stove, turning biscuits in the pan, when the sound of wagon wheels rolled into the yard. A stranger climbed down, carrying polished boots and a dark wool coat too fine for ranch work. The horses in the traces bore the painted initials of Chisholm Stock and Freight along their harness straps. Elias's shoulders tightened the moment he spotted the visitor crossing the yard toward the barn. "Buyer," he muttered shortly. "Horse contract." Ruth nodded once and returned to the stove, though she noticed him flex his injured hand beneath the glove before stepping back outside. The ranch stayed uneasy the rest of the morning. Voices drifted from the barn lot while the buyer inspected mares and checked teeth, hooves, and movement with the cold attention of a man pricing lumber. Ruth carried fresh water from the pump and tried not to watch, but every now and then her eyes found Elias near the rail fence, jaw set hard beneath the brim of his hat. He moved carefully today. Near midday, shouting broke across the pasture. Ruth dropped the feed sack in her hands and ran toward the lower corral beside Red Hollow Creek. One of the mares had panicked against a stretch of rusted wire loosened from an old cedar post. The animal reared hard, twisting herself deeper into the fencing, while Elias struggled to steady her, one-handed before she shattered her leg against the rail. "Easy," he barked, breath sharp with strain. The mare kicked again. Ruth saw it then, his right hand failing beneath the pressure, fingers losing grip against the rope. For one dangerous second, Elias nearly went down, beneath the horse's shoulder. Without thinking, Ruth snatched the farrier knife from his belt and cut through the tangled wire near the mare's flank. "Easy now," she whispered low toward the horse. "Easy, girl." Something in her voice reached the animal where force had failed. The mare staggered backward, trembling, nostrils wide with fear, but finally steadied enough for Elias to guide her clear of the broken fence. Afterward, neither of them breathed right for a while. The buyer muttered something about returning next week and climbed back into his wagon fast enough to avoid the tension hanging over the yard. Elias stood near the rail fence, staring at his bleeding knuckles where the rope had burned through the glove. He looked angrier at himself than at the horse. Ruth fetched water without asking. At the wash basin beside the barn, she cleaned the blood from his hand carefully, while the wind rattled dead grass along the creek bank nearby. Elias stayed still beneath her touch, though once his jaw tightened when cold water struck the swollen joints beneath the brace. "It never healed proper," he said finally. Ruth glanced up. "The hand?" He nodded once. "Rodeo fall near Abilene, 5 years back." His voice stayed flat, almost careless. "Doctor told me it's stiffen worse every winter." Ruth wrapped a clean cloth around his knuckles and tied the knot gently. "You don't have to pretend with me." The words settled between them quieter than the creek behind the barn. Elias looked at her then, fully. Not the guarded glance he usually gave across doorways or supper plates, but something steadier. Ruth held his gaze only a second before lowering her eyes back to the bandage, though warmth had already risen beneath her collar despite the cold air. That evening the ranch house felt different somehow, less hollow. Elias sat near the stove mending harness buckles while Ruth stitched one of his worn work shirts beside the fire, using thread pulled loose from the hem of her own undersleeve. Neither spoke much. The soft scrape of needle through cloth and the crackle of mesquite wood filled most of the room. At one point Elias reached automatically for the cracked blue mug near the stove, before pausing halfway there. Ruth had already filled it with fresh coffee. His eyes lifted toward her across the firelight. For a moment, he looked as though he meant to say something more than thank you. But he only nodded once and wrapped both hands carefully around the warmth. The next day arrived softer than the ones before, though the sky remained pale with dust drifting in from the western flats. Ruth woke to the sound of Elias, already outside, splitting cedar near the barn, each strike of the axe carrying through the cold morning air in slow, steady rhythm. She stood at the kitchen sink, watching him through the window, a moment longer than necessary before turning back toward the stove. Something inside her had begun paying attention against her better judgment. By noon, a railroad broker arrived in a mud-streaked wagon carrying rolled survey maps beneath one arm. Ruth recognized the type immediately. Men who smelled faintly of cigar smoke and train soot usually came attached to bad news for somebody. Elias met him outside near the stock pens, while Ruth carried fresh water toward the porch, meaning only to pass through unnoticed. Then she heard the broker say, "You sell the south pasture now. You might keep the rest afloat through summer drought." Her steps slowed. The men stood near the fence line, with their backs partly turned, the broker pointing across the distant grazing land, while Elias listened in silence. The words that followed reached her only in pieces. Reduced operations, fewer horses, better than losing everything outright, temporary. The word settled heavily inside her chest, though no one had spoken it directly. Ruth walked back toward the house before either man noticed her standing there. By the time Elias returned an hour later, she had already folded the repaired work shirts neatly beside his room door and packed half her belongings into the satchel resting near the bed. She pulled away first. That evening, supper passed beneath the soft ticking of the kitchen clock from Mercer. Dry goods mounted crooked above the pantry shelf. Elias sat across from her at the table, though neither ate much beyond a few spoonfuls of stew, growing colder by the minute. Wind rattled faintly against the windows, while somewhere outside a loose gate hinge knocked steady against cedar posts. Ruth kept her eyes lowered toward her plate. Elias noticed the packed satchel before she realized he had seen it. The leather straps had been buckled tight, the folded clinic receipt tucked carefully into the side pocket once more. He stared at it a long moment from across the room, something unreadable moving behind his tired gray eyes. "You heading back into town tomorrow?" he asked quietly. Ruth set down her spoon. That was always the arrangement. The words sounded smaller spoken aloud. Elias leaned back slowly in the chair, one rough hand resting against the edge of the table. Firelight caught the lines beside his eyes, deeper tonight than before. For a moment he looked not angry exactly, but caught off guard by something he should have expected. "You were planning to leave Fort Worth entirely," he said. Not quite a question. Ruth hesitated before answering. "There's not much keeping me here." The silence after that stretched long enough for the stove wood to collapse inward with a hiss of sparks. Elias lowered his gaze toward the cracked blue mug near his elbow, thumb brushing the chipped handle once the way he always did while thinking. Finally, he spoke again. That contract wording, his voice stayed rough from disuse, shouldn't have been said that way. Ruth looked up then. Elias met her eyes steadily despite the discomfort written plain across his face. Apologies did not seem to come naturally to him. She understood that much already. "No person belongs to me," he said quietly. Something in her expression softened before she could stop it. "Most people hear ownership before they hear kindness," she answered. Elias absorbed the words without defense, just sat there, listening, while the kitchen clock ticked overhead and the wind moved slow across the porch outside. Ruth saw then that whatever hardness lived in him had not been built for cruelty, more likely survival. Later that night, the lantern burned low between their separate rooms, while the ranch settled into uneasy quiet around them. Ruth lay awake beneath the wool blanket, staring at shadows crossing the ceiling boards overhead. Every so often she heard Elias moving faintly in the next room, Boots against floorboards, the scrape of chair legs, the restless pacing of a man no longer comfortable inside his own solitude. Neither of them slept much before dawn, finally began creeping pale and gray against the windows. When Ruth woke again, the ranch house stood empty. The stove had already been lit, though the fire burned low now beneath the kettle. Elias's hat was gone from the hook beside the door, along with the heavy brown coat he wore into town. Through the kitchen window, Ruth spotted wagon tracks still fresh in the dirt beyond the cedar gate, leading east toward Fort Worth, beneath a sky turning warm for late winter. She folded the blanket carefully before packing the last of her things. By mid-morning, sunlight spread soft across the south pasture, turning the dry grass pale gold beneath the cottonwood trees near the creek bed. Ruth stood at the kitchen table, tying shut her satchel when hoofbeats finally sounded outside the house. Elias returned alone. Dust clung to his boots and the collar of his coat as he stepped through the doorway, carrying a folded paper in one hand. For a second, neither of them moved. The room felt smaller than it had 3 days earlier, crowded now with things unsaid. Elias crossed the kitchen quietly and placed the document beside Ruth's breakfast plate. The Miller Creek Clinic receipt. Stamped across the front in dark blue ink were the words "paid in full." Ruth stared at the paper without touching it. Her brother's name sat there beneath the stamp, exactly where it always had. Only now the weight attached to it seemed suddenly lighter than she knew how to carry. She swallowed once before lifting her eyes toward Elias. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said softly. "I did." He removed his gloves slowly, flexing the stiff fingers beneath the leather brace before resting both hands against the back of the chair. Outside, horses shifted in the nearby pasture, while somewhere down the road, a freight wagon rolled faint and distant toward the rail depot. "You don't owe anybody anything now," Elias said. "Not me. Not this ranch. Not whatever's been following you around all this time." Ruth looked away first. No one had spoken to her that way in years, not carefully. Not without expecting something in return afterward. She pressed one hand flat against the edge of the table just to steady herself, while silence settled softly between them again. But this silence felt different that afternoon. Elias walked the south pasture fence line alone, while Ruth remained near the barn sorting invoices and feed orders beside the open stable doors. The railroad maps still sat rolled on the workbench where the broker left them, edges curling in the dry wind. When Elias finally returned near sunset, dust coated the hems of his trousers and weariness sat deep around his eyes. "I'm keeping the south field," he said simply. Ruth glanced up from the ledger book in her lap. "The railroad offer would have covered most the debt," Elias went on. "But selling all of it feels too close to burying the place." He leaned one shoulder against the stable doorway, gaze drifting toward the horses beyond the fence. "There's enough room here for injured stock. Horses nobody wants to put down, but nobody wants to keep either." Ruth studied him quietly. The fading light caught the tired lines beside his mouth, the stubbornness in his posture, the uncertainty hidden beneath both. For the first time since arriving, she realized Elias Boone was not only trying to save land. He was trying to save himself along with it. "You'd need stronger partition rails," she said after a moment, "and separate feed storage if you're housing recovery animals near healthy stock." Elias blinked once. Then the corner of his mouth moved almost like a smile before settling again. "You already planning the place for me?" Ruth lowered her eyes back toward the invoices, though warmth crept into her face despite herself. "Somebody ought to." Weeks passed quietly after that. The weather softened inch by inch across the land west of Fort Worth. Mesquite branches carried the first signs of spring, while freight wagons rolled steadier along County Road 19 under clear evening skies. Ruth took over most of the ranch invoices at the kitchen table, her careful handwriting replacing Elias's rough, uneven figures in the ledgers. Elias repaired saddle straps beside the porch. After supper, the cracked blue mug never far from reach now because she always remembered to refill it before he asked. The house no longer sounded lonely. One evening, Ruth stepped outside just before dusk, carrying a stack of account papers against her chest. The front door remained open behind her, warm firelight spilling softly across the porch boards into the cooling air. Elias looked up from the saddle in his lap as she settled beside him. On the step, neither speaking for a while. Across the pasture, the horses moved slow beneath the fading Texas sky. Ruth listened to the steady sounds of the ranch around them. Fence chains rattling lightly in the wind, distant cattle lowing somewhere beyond the creek. Elias breathing beside her in the quiet, and realized she had stopped counting the days since she arrived. Some people spend years searching for dignity and never realize it often begins the moment someone finally stops treating them like something temporary. If this story stayed with you tonight, leave a simple 1 down in the comments, so I know you were here with Ruth and Elias until the very end. And if you still believe quiet love, second chances, and good people finding their way home matter in this world, subscribe to the channel and come ride with us into the next story waiting just beyond the horizon.